Alright, subscribers, welcome back to another episode of Science with Surback. In this episode, what we're going to be talking about is Intro to Chem and Physics, section 16.1, that deals with the nature of light. So we just got out of a section talking about the details of sound and sound waves and how us as humans interpret that sound via our ears and how they work. And now we shift gears and we look at light. Now, a couple of things before we get into details here, a couple of objectives I want you to be able to meet. Objective number 1 is describe the scientific models of light. And then objective number 2 is determine how or what the electromagnetic spectrum consists of. So we start out here with the different models of light. And this is a difficult task to accomplish. So there are multiple models of light that is used to describe the behavior and characteristics of light. A single model of light is just not able to describe all the properties of light. Now, there are two common models associated with the description and characteristics of light. The first of these two models is the wave model. The second type of model is the particle model. So to be able to describe these two models, we have to have some background information here, and we start out with this business of how light waves interfere with each other. So what I have here is I have an image of what I talk about interference. And if you remember in our chapter on waves, we talked about constructive and destructive interference. So we take that and we keep that in the back of our mind and we use this image. I want you to have this image in your head as we go through this. So what happens here, these red beams here represent our light. And it goes through these tiny openings in this particular barrier. And as this happens, it changes the wave characteristics of light. And then it produces this particular interference. So a couple of things about that. Number one, light waves are going to interfere with each other. And from that picture I just showed you, when light waves interfere with one another, they are going to have this stripe pattern of interference form. So I want to walk you through that picture that I showed you just a little while ago. And that picture was actually from an experiment made or produced by Thomas Young in 1801. So what Thomas Young did specifically here is he did this exact experiment that I have in my hand. He took a red beam of light and he passed them through two narrow openings. Now what he found was that the waves or the light interferes with each other to produce this type of interference on this background wall. And so what he found as this beam of light passed through these two openings is that a stripe pattern on the screen was observed. And so the major thing that happened here was this. The major conclusion was that this was considered or consistent with along the lines that light behaved as wave. So this was significant in his conclusions here that he said, hey, light is going to consist of waves. And really this was the birth of this wave model of light. So what we transition to is this wave model of light. And so we have this. The wave model of light is described as a transverse wave that does not require a medium in which to travel. Now, in the wave model of light, we can vary what type of light that we're discussing or what type of light we're dealing with based on the properties of that transverse wave. Now, it can specifically vary through that transverse wave's amplitude, wavelength, or frequency. Now, with the wave model of light, a term that was associated with this particular model of light was electromagnetic waves. And this term of electromagnetic wave is just a term that describes light because waves consist of changing electric and magnetic fields. Now, with this wave model in mind and this term of electromagnetic waves, this model could explain a number of phenomena with light. It could explain how light waves interfere with one another. It could also explain why light refracts when it passes a surface such as a mirror. Another thing it could explain is why light waves reflect when they pass a surface such as a mirror. And I made a minor mistake here. Refracts associated with a lens, reflect associated with a mirror. I just had those flipped, so know that. And then the final thing that the wave model of light could explain was why light waves diffract when they pass through narrow openings, like the experiment performed by Thomas Young. Now, the one thing that the wave model, the one significant thing that the wave model couldn't explain was a concept known as the photoelectric effect. And so what the photoelectric effect was, I'm going to grab another sheet of paper, was this. So I have this. I have an example of red lights, an example of blue lights. And what the photoelectric effect is if the intensity of a light was great enough, it ejected these electrons. But the wave model, if we use the concepts of the wave model, both of these things should either eject or not eject the electron. So why, if we have light, red light, shining down on the same metal, it can't bump off these electrons, why then, if we just change to blue light, why can't it have enough power to knock these electrons off? If light is viewed as a model, or a wave model, excuse me, then both of these things should be equal. So what scientists set out to find is why exactly where were there differences here, and why couldn't the wave model explain this? So what they did was this. They speculated, number one, that the energy difference in each of these things should knock the electrons off. But the wave model can't explain why red light does not knock the electrons off and why blue light does knock these electrons off. So what we focus our attention now is another model that explained that phenomenon shown in that particular picture. So we shift gears here to the particle model of light. So with the particle model of light, again, the whole goal of this model is to be able to explain that photoelectric effect. So the particle model of light describes light as energy packets or units of lights called photons. So the major thing with this model of light is we need these major energy packets that are able to knock those electrons off in the case of some light. Now, these photons here, the photons are a unit of quantum or light. Now, these photons and lights are considered to be particles. However, they don't really act. They don't act like particles how we would normally describe them. So things like air particles or particles in matter, they don't have that same type of concept associated with this term of photons. So if photons don't act as ordinary I made a mistake here. Ordinary particles, not ordinary photons there. Yep, that's a minor mistake there. Ordinary particles. So if photons don't act as ordinary particles, then they have to have some unique properties that are associated with them. So the first unique property of a photon is that they do not have any mass. The second property is they act like bundles of energy. And then that third property is that the energy of a photon is located in a specific area. And this is much, much different than the energy associated with a wave, which is spread out evenly throughout that wave. So with that basic knowledge of this particle model of light and this business about photons knocked out, now we can get back to this picture. So remember, in this picture right here, it is showing that red light does not knock these electrons or does not break these electrons off of this metal surface, but a blue light, if a blue light is shining on this metal surface, then these electrons are said to knock off. And there's ways that they can actually detect if the electron is breaking off of that metal or shooting away from the metal. So the big thing here is a particle model of light needs to explain what is happening here. So we get to this. The particle model explains the photoelectric effect. So the way in which this model is going to explain the photoelectric effect is this. The blue light. What happens with the blue light? A single packet of blue light, or you could say a single photon of blue light, has enough energy to knock an electron off of that metal plate. The red light, on the other hand, from this picture, does not knock any electrons off of the metal plate there. And so what happens here is that the red light, it's going to contain a lot of packets of energy, but no packet of energy or no photon of energy from that red light is going to be strong enough to knock electrons off the metal plate. So we have to wrap our minds around a lot here to understand completely the photoelectric effect and the particle model of light. So we know that light has unique characteristics and it moves by oscillating between electric and magnetic fields, and it is going to have, in some scenarios, enough energy to quote-unquote knock these electrons off, and in some cases it is not. So remember, the wavelength is associated with light or the electromagnetic radiation, and so if the wavelength is correlated to these two things, that means as we increase or as we decrease wavelength, our energy associated with that specific light is going to change. So as we change the light we're working with, we also change the amount of energy that particular light has. So this was a major thing, and I know it doesn't seem like much, but it's a major thing. We can now think of light acting as a wave, as a transverse wave, and we can also think of it acting as a particle to pack a punch or pack enough energy to do something to another object. So we can actually have that transfer of our objects. So that leads us to our next thing, and that's really combining each of these two models together. And this right here, really the particle model of light, and this business right here, It was the big work of Einstein and other really famous scientists of the late 19 teens, 20s, and 1930s. And they did a ton of work. There's a lot of research behind this. And they put a lot of things that were thought to be theoretical, and they made sense of them. Extremely great concept they learned there. If you ever are into something or want to learn something more about that. Anyways, that brings us to the dual nature of light. And so the duality of light, which it's also called, is just saying that light is going to have a dual nature in that it can be both a wave or behave both as a wave and as a particle. Now you can't have one without the other. So when we talk about light, it is going to have characteristics that come from that wave nature, and it's going to have characteristics that come from that particle nature. So what happened here is that both models, we just saw both models are used to explain light's behavior in nature. And to explain how light is behaving, we have to look at the unique scenario. So depending on whether we're talking about the picture like this, where we talked about or we had the light interacting with each other, interfering, and produces these patterns, or we have to talk about how light can knock or not knock off electrons. The scenario determines when we need to use the wave model and when we need to use the particle model. So I want to take the next portion of the page to dedicate this. I want to explain what model best explains the observations of the wave model and the observations from the particle model. So we'll start out with this. The wave model is going to best explain the interference of light. And so that interference of light was this picture I've shown a couple times, was this. That's best explained through the wave model, or light acting as a wave. Now, the particle model best explains two things. The first thing that it best explains is the way in which light travels through empty space without a medium. The other thing that it best explains is the ability to explain the photoelectric effect. Remember, the photoelectric effect is this picture here that says, hey, blue light has enough energy, or the photons have enough energy to knock electrons off, or the red light does not have enough energy to knock those particles or knock those electrons off the metal surface. So those are some big concepts that we've talked about. I know we've just spent 2 pages of notes going through this, but remember, and if you Google the photoelectric effect or Einstein's work on the atom and on light, he has a ton of information, and there's a ton of information out there on how they put all this together to explain, hey, light has to act as both a model of waves and a model of particles to explain its specific behavior. So with that in mind, again, this is like a snapshot in time of how light behaves. We can talk about the specifics of light. And so those specifics come in the energy and the speed of light. So we start up top here with the energy of light. Now, light is going to carry energy in the form of photons. And remember, these photons carry those small packets of energy. And we call those small pockets of energy or packets of energy photons. Now, this amount of energy in a photon is dependent upon two things. The first of these two things is the frequency of that light wave, or the electromagnetic wave specifically. And the second thing it is dependent upon is the wavelength of that electromagnetic wave. Now remember, electromagnetic is just another term for light. Now again, I just want to write this down. Electromagnetic can be interchanged with light. Same thing up top here. This electromagnetic is the same thing as light. Now, what I want to show you is how that energy changes from time to time based on these two factors. I want to get back to that business on red and blue light. So over here, what we're going to have on this side of the page, I'm going to talk to you about the facts of red light. And then over here, nearly splitting the page here, we are going to talk about blue light. So the first thing here, the first property, the first thing is talking about the wavelength. Red light has a wavelength of 3.33 times 10 to the negative 7th meters. Now blue light has a wavelength of blue light, on the other hand, has a wavelength of so I made a minor mistake here. I accidentally wrote down the wavelength for UV light instead of red light here, and that will make a little bit of a difference here. So red light, back to red light's wavelength here. Red light is going to have a wavelength of about 6.35 times 10 to the negative 7th meters. Now, the wavelength for blue light is going to be a little bit different here, and that's because we have a different type of electromagnetic radiation we're dealing with. That wavelength for blue light is going to be about 4.5 times 10 to the negative 7th meters. Now, the frequency for red light is 4.72 times 10 to the 14th hertz. And the frequency for blue light is going to be 6.67 times 10 to the 14th hertz. Now, what this all comes down to, you can actually use the frequency and you multiply it by what we call Planck's constant, which is 6.634 times 10 to the negative 34th times your frequency, and that gives you your energy. So the energy for red light is 3.13 times 10 to the negative 19th joules. And I know it's a little bit difficult to see, but this number here is 3.13 times 10 to the negative 19th joules. Now for blue light, the energy is 4.42 times 10 to the negative 19th joules. Again, this number right here for the energy of blue light is 4.42 times 10 to the negative 19th joules. So remember, blue light is going to have more energy than red light is, and that's shown in that experiment. And if you look closely, and I know this is a really small number, but 4.42 is bigger than 3.13, and more energy means there's more impact when that light runs into that metal surface. So this is why blue light can eject that photon. It has enough energy to allow that photon to be ejected. Okay, so moving down to the speed of light. So all light that is traveling in a vacuum is going to travel at the same speed. Now the speed of light in a vacuum is approximately 3.0 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. Now to put that speed into perspective here, that's 186,000 miles per every second. That is a lot of miles in 1 second. Now, this speed of light is represented by the symbol c. Now, we mentioned some facts here about light traveling through a vacuum, but light, the speed of light, is going to be dependent on two things, or it's going to be dependent on the medium that it moves through. Light is going to move fastest through gases, and it's going to move slowest through solids. Now, since we have this business about energy and speed, and we've talked about it, now we can move on to light's intensity. So we'll shift gears here a little bit, and we'll talk about, well, what does the intensity of light have to do with some of those properties? So the intensity of light is simply defined as the rate at which energy flows through a given area of space. And the intensity of light is going to be dependent upon two factors. The first of these factors is the number of photons per second, that's ultimately the power, that passes through a certain area of space. So a good example of this first factor here is a 100-watt light bulb is going to have higher intensity than a 60-watt light bulb. The other factor light intensity depends on is the distance from the light source. So as you get further and further away from a light source, you are going to decrease the intensity you receive from that light. So a good example to talk about light's intensity is a street lamp. So the first thing to establish here is that a street lamp is going to have a consistent power output in the light itself. Now, as you get a greater and greater distance away from that street lamp, the light will appear a little bit dimmer and dimmer and dimmer the further away that you get, and this is because that intensity is decreasing as you increase the distance from that light source. So two things are happening as this intensity of light decreases as you get further and further away from the light. Number one, the light is going to spread out in spherical wavefront. And then the second thing that happens as you get further and further away from a light source is the number of photons that pass through a given area is going to decrease. All right, so now we've talked a lot about the details of light. We can get into one specific area known as the electromagnetic spectrum. So the electromagnetic spectrum is really, really useful in a lot of sciences, physics, chemistry, and other application, even things like biology. If you take the certain wavelength of the sun's radiation and you utilize it to find out what type of source a plant will go through photosynthesis best, there's just a number of applications. And one of my favorite pictures or favorite electromagnetic spectrum is this. Now, this picture here shows the wavelength in meters up top, and then it shows the frequency on the bottom. Now, notice a couple of things. This is really big. It's 3 times 10 to the 4th power wavelength, and that's in meters. That's a really large number. And then we have this. As we go from left to right, the wavelength is going to get really, really small. It has a times 10 to the negative 14th power. Now on bottom, just the opposites occurs. As we have a really big wavelength, the frequency measured in hertz it's still a big number, but it's still relatively small compared to something on the right. Look at that frequency, which frequency in this case is going to be equivalent to the amount of energy. So as we go from left to right in this chart, our wavelength's going to decrease, but our frequency and energy increase. So anyways, that's a little preview of the electromagnetic spectrum. But the electromagnetic spectrum is going to consist of light waves at all possible energies, frequencies, and wavelengths. And that's what that chart just showed you. So to give you an overview, I want to bring back this picture, and hopefully it'll sit right here at the bottom, to give you an overview of the electromagnetic spectrum. We have a couple of things to talk about. The first of which is that these light waves are going to consist from everything from radio waves all the way over here on the right to gamma rays. And then the other thing here is that these light waves are all going to have similar characteristics in that they both behave as a wave, and they still have that particle model to describe each of these types of light waves. The big difference in these light waves is going to be in their wavelengths and their frequencies. And then the last point I want to make about the electromagnetic spectrum is this. They have numerous uses. They consist of everything from radio waves that we hear when we turn on our car radio, to radar guns can detect that speed, to even cancer treatments. When you look at things over here with this high energy or high frequency waves, as they can be used as a cancer treatment. So we now have a broad idea and a broad overview of the electromagnetic spectrum. What I want to go through is each of these significant areas of the electromagnetic spectrum and talk a little bit more in depth and in detail about each of these forms of light. So we start over here with radio waves. Radio waves are going to have the longest wavelength in the electromagnetic spectrum. And they really consist of a really large category, a really large range of wavelengths too. They can consist of anything from tenths of a meter to thousands of meters in length. So we have a really broad range here with our radio waves. And now these radio waves include waves that are used to transmit TV signals, AM/FM radio signals, and can be used in radar. Now I want to talk a little bit more in depth and in more detail on this topic of radar. So number one, I was a former air defense battle management system operator in the Army Air Defense Artillery Corps there. ADA, first to fire there. But radar is going to be defined as a system that uses reflected radio waves to determine the velocity and location of objects. So specifically how radar works is by doing this. Out of a radar, radio waves are emitted into the air, and then they're going to bounce off an object located within the air. When that radar or those radio waves return after they bounce off the object, the location in which they are emitted from is captured by that radar device. So again, how radar works is they utilize radio waves. It emits those radio waves in all directions, and if it bounces off a certain object, that is going to reflect that radio wave, and they are going to return to where they're originally emitted from. Now the radar is set up in a couple different ways. Like a radar gun would give you the speed that object is traveling. A radar like our air defense system uses builds essentially a picture of what is happening in the sky. So some pretty cool technology out of really some pretty simple light waves, these radio waves. So now we can transfer to two other categories of the electromagnetic spectrum, and that is microwaves and IR waves down here. We start out here with microwaves, and these things are just electromagnetic waves with wavelengths in the range of centimeters. So we've gone from really big waves now to down to light that consists of just a few centimeters in length. And so the uses of microwaves, what they're really used for is they are used to carry telecommunication signals over a long distance. So we actually have some unique properties of microwaves. The first property is that they are reflected by metals. The second property is that they're easily transmitted through air, glass, paper, and plastic. And so the microwaves aren't only the name for this electromagnetic spectrum, but the microwave ovens that a lot of us probably have in our kitchens, these things, those microwave ovens, actually use microwaves to heat up food. So what happens here is that as a microwave is turned on, these microwaves inside the microwave oven, they're going to have wavelengths about 3 to 5 centimeters. And so as those wavelengths move inside that microwave oven, the food itself is going to have water molecules which begin to vibrate, and as you vibrate those water molecules, they get a little bit more excited and they release food, and thus they cook the food as the microwave energy is transmitted from the source, that light that you see in there, to and into the microwave, and then it heats up the water inside your food. That water vibrates and transfers that heat then to your food. So that's specifically how those microwaves are going to heat up those food, or that food that you place into it. The other type of electromagnetic spectrum that we need to talk about here on this page is infrared waves. Now, infrared waves are going to consist of electromagnetic waves that have wavelengths slightly longer than the wavelengths of red visible light. So to give you an idea here of what I'm talking about when I talk about the wavelengths here, we bring back our electromagnetic spectrum. Now this little sliver that I have my finger on is just the visible spectrum. And that's the spectrum that we can actually see. Now, red light, if you look over here, red light is way on the left side of the visible spectrum, and you can see that it's still going to have relatively large wavelengths, or a little bit larger than what we can see. And it also is going to have a little bit less energy. Now, being in the military, we do use night vision goggles, and how night vision goggles work is they pick up on those wavelengths that are a little bit bigger, the infrared wavelengths, and through the device, through the actual night vision goggles, it's able to enhance that view and allow us to see things at night. And that's because it's picking up that infrared radiation, and then it's interpreting it through how the device is made, and that's how we're able to see. The uses of infrared waves. There's a lot of uses, but the uses we'll go over are these. Number one, they're used in heat lamps to warm food. And then another use that I'm going to give you is that IR light from the sun can warm the earth. Now, I gave you one example of how we can utilize IR waves in night vision goggles, but it's important to be able to sense these infrared waves. So one example of sensing infrared waves is a simple computer mouse. What it's going to do, it's going to transmit an infrared wave that computers can detect and allow users to navigate their computer. Another example, I'm not going to write this one down, but infrared sensors on weather satellites can record temperature changes in the atmosphere, and they can actually track movements of clouds. So they actually use IR satellites to help predict the weather, help predict where that next storm front might be from those movement of clouds. Now, the last two areas of the electromagnetic spectrum that I'd like to discuss is going to be UV rays and then our X-rays and gamma rays. So our UV waves, these are invisible light that has smaller wavelengths than violet light on the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, it's good to give you a perspective of what we talk about with where this is on the electromagnetic spectrum. So over here on the visible spectrum, violet light, that's this purple color here, is all the way over here on the right. And you can see UV, or ultraviolet light, is going to be further to the right, which means it has smaller wavelengths than violet light, and it also has greater amounts of energy. So that's my next point here, is that UV waves or UV radiation is going to have higher energy and shorter wavelengths than visible light. So while we're on the topic of UV waves, I'm sure you've heard about UV radiation if you're out in the sun and some of the dangers that may be associated with this UV radiation. But I want to give you some of the facts. So UV light is in fact emitted by the sun. Now, UV light, the only source of UV light is not from just the sun. There's numerous other sources, but we want to hone in on UV light from the sun. 9% of the sun's energy is from UV light. Now, that UV light that does come from the sun and comes towards Earth is most of the time absorbed by our ozone layer in our atmosphere. However, and the key word here is most of that UV light is absorbed. Some of that UV light is going to get through. And what happened here to the UV light that does get through, that's the one that can be damaging to your skin and can cause those sunburns if you go out in the sun without any sunscreen or protection from the sun via a clothing layer. So our last type of radiation, or I guess our last two types of radiation, are X-rays and gamma rays. So we start out here with X-rays. These are going to have higher energy and shorter wavelengths than the UV waves do. Now, typically X-rays are going to have wavelengths of less than 1 × 10⁻⁸ meters. Now, how an X-ray image work is this. These X-rays, this type of radiation, is going to be passed through the body. Now, most of these things are passed through the body. There are some of these X-rays that are absorbed by bones and other tissues, and that's why it's dangerous not to have multiple X-rays, or if you're an X-ray tech, they step out of the room and they protect themselves, because multiple X-rays on that bone or on that tissue will actually damage it and cause harmful effects. But anyways, most of them are going to pass through, and the waves that pass through are going to be absorbed by a photographic plate that allows us to produce that image. Now, gamma rays, this is going to be the electromagnetic waves with the highest energy and the shortest wavelengths. Now, because of this great amount of energy, these gamma rays can be used to treat cancer by killing the diseased cells. Now, both X-rays and gamma rays, I'm not going to write this down, but both X-rays and gamma rays are potentially dangerous to us as humans or any other living object. And that's because they're going to have a high energy that could kill living cells within the body. So yes, gamma rays are used to treat cancer, but what they do, yes, they can target and specify as much as possible to try to kill those particular cancer cells, but what they're also going to do is they're going to kill those healthy living cells. And so that's why it's potentially harmful and dangerous to get that gamma radiations. And so when you put either of these X-rays or gamma rays, you potentially could take those healthy living cells and you could turn them into cancerous cells. Now, it's not something like the Hulk where you'll turn green and get giant muscles. This is something really harmful to your body. All right, so this concludes section 16.2. Another pretty long section here, but I hope you have enjoyed this section. And as always, subscribe.